Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Captain Kirk and Rick podcast with your host, Captain Kirk, and co-host, Rick. And this week's guest host, the Curb Stompster. So sit down, get ready, and enjoy the show.
All right. Welcome to the Captain Kirk and Rick show.
Starring Curb Stomp. That's me.
And Captain Kirk, that's me.
And Rick, that's me, twice.
We only need one of you, Rick.
I know, you only need half of one of me.
That probably is enough.
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to talk about many important things like we always do. And since Glenn Frey died a little over a month ago on January 18th, and because he was a member of a supergroup called the Eagles, we're going to dedicate this show to Glenn Frey, and we're going to talk a lot about him and how he started the Eagles.
How did he start the Eagles?
It's a long story, Rick, so I'll get on it.
Good.
He grew up in Detroit, and he says he grew up running, fast running, like
track.
Okay. And that's
like
because all the kids he lived around were sons and daughters of the auto workers, and they were really tough, and they were beating him up. So he learned how to run fast because he didn't like getting beat up by girls.
Didn't like getting beat up by Curb Stomp.
Yeah.
And then he started playing the piano when he was 5.
Whoa.
That would be another reason to get beat up, because back then it wasn't cool to be a boy and play the piano.
No, but if you start at 5, you're some kind of prodigy. So
He did have music in him. Back then, Motown was what people were listening to in Detroit. You know, that would have been in 1952. And so that's the type of music he listened to. Then he started wrestling, and he started getting tough, and he thought piano wasn't cool, so he quit when he was 12, kind of like I did. I played piano for quite a while, and I quit.
Quitter.
And I became the trumpeter. But that's another story. Anyway, so he had a machinist father. He says, I always had decent clothes, and, you know, that just means, if you think back to that time, a lot of people probably were really, really poor. He's saying, no, I wasn't poor. Every year he went to a week at camp. And in high school, he was even in a class for very gifted students.
I took some of
Gifted
those.
class.
But what really changed his life was he went to a Beatles concert with his dad.
That would be a life-changing experience.
And what do you think the girls were doing there?
Throwing
Going
their
crazy.
shirts at the
They were
Beatles.
Yep, they were swooning, they were fainting, they were screaming.
Oh, yeah. Fangirling real hard.
And he was like, this is pretty cool. I need girls to like me like this. So he became a guitar player.
I think we've all had that dream. You know?
Yeah, and
You've had
somehow
that
he
dream
just
of-
made a...
I
Girl
want
fans.
girls to love me.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Just kidding.
Curb Stomp's scaring me now. Oh, but anyway, so all of a sudden he started a band called the Subterraneans, and they were doing British covers. Then he moved to a Who-like sound. Aren't you
The
going to
Who.
say Who?
Who's the Who?
Yeah, Who's the Who? You guys are so young. Do you know who the Who is?
I heard of them.
Okay.
Like, I think I've seen them on T-shirts and such.
They were a super band back in the time, kind of like Led Zeppelin. All right? Anyway, so then that band he had called the Mushrooms. They were actually the most popular Detroit band in 1966.
Oh, wow.
Then he ran into a guy named Bob Seger. Have you ever heard of him?
I've heard of Bob.
Anyway,
Seger.
so Bob Seger befriended Glenn, and he helped him co-wrote a single that made it on the radio called "Such a Lovely Child," and it was quite popular back in Detroit at that time. And then Seeger wrote and performed Ramblin' Man and had Glenn sing the backup vocals. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard Ramblin' Man. It's a really big song, but the backup vocals are really loud, really strong. And it was something I just learned, that he was the guy doing that, and I could really hear him in that. That was cool. He was also the bass player. So he was hanging out with the Bob Seger band, smoking lots of pot, having a good time. And Bob Seger wanted to make a new band centered around him and Glenn Frey.
Good idea.
It was a good idea, but
they couldn't agree on a name.
That's a good choice. That's a good choice.
It's a good reason to break up.
Actually, I forgot who we're talking about. Oh, Glenn Frey.
Yeah.
Glenn Frey's mom caught him in his basement smoking pot. So she went to Bob Seger's manager and said, this kid is not ready for rock and roll, and put a wrench in the whole thing and got rid of Bob Seger and the band.
Rookie mistake
Man.
in the basement.
There's a lot of places to smoke pot, and the basement's a good one.
Not when your mom's home.
Yeah, that's the problem. Back then, the older people didn't even know what pot smelled like. I was from back in that time, and I'll tell you what, we could smoke pot just about anywhere and get away with it. Did I say that? Oh. In fact, it was legal to smoke pot back then.
Was it?
Yes, it was.
That time's coming back around.
Yeah.
Round 2.
Actually, it wasn't legal back then, but we all thought it should be.
Oh, okay, that's like right now.
Yeah, and we all were like, someday this will be legal. Well, 50 years later, look what's happening.
You were right.
Yeah.
Colorado.
Anyway, so he went and started another band. He tried college, and he said the thing about college was he was more into the hippie thing. And hippies were cool back then. I liked hippies. Cool. Hippies are cool. Free love, all that. His band was called The Four of Us. And back then, the Beach Boys were getting pretty big, and they were singing about California and all the hot girls in California.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I love them.
Oh.
Yeah.
Once again.
Oh.
I meant the Beach Boys.
Oh, man. She keeps talking about hot girls.
Yeah, I don't...
Anyway.
No, that time I meant the Beach Boys.
Oh, all right.
Who doesn't love
all right.
them?
So, anyway,
I do love the Beach Boys.
Glenn did think that sounded really cool, you know, the free love, the drugs, and he thought he was probably going to get drafted, and he thought, if I go to California, they won't be able to find me. And so he headed to California. He took another friend that was in the band with him, and he already had a girlfriend that had headed over there. She happened to be living with her sister, who dated a guy named J.D. Souther. And J.D. Souther was an early rock and roller. And he became fast friends with Glenn, and Glenn really liked to smoke lots of pot with him. So, I find it really amazing how Glenn just ran into all these people. It's just like he was destined to become a great like he was. So anyway, at this time, they were in L.A., and there was a big club scene going on. One was called the Whiskey, one was called the Troubadour. The Troubadour was pretty cool because they would have times when they would just let people get up there and play. You didn't have to be famous, nothing, just get up and play. And so there was a lot of new starts there. There was some really established people. He met Jackson Browne there. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
Well, anyway, he was quite popular in the 70s and had some hits like Running on Empty.
I've heard that
things
song.
like that. He's kind of country, you know. Well, the Eagles started this. You'll see how this was kind of a country started band. Anyway, so Glenn and Souther rented a house down there for $135 a month, and they rented the basement to Jackson Brown for $35 a month. Do the math. In a house for $100 a month. You can't beat that, can you?
Sure can't.
So, and that is where Glenn said he learned how to write music. Jackson Brown would be in the basement, and he'd hear him come up with a little strand of music, and then before long there would be a verse. Before long there would be words to this verse, and he would do it 20 times, just over and over. And then there would be this teapot that would start whistling. It'd go silent for about half an hour. Then all of a sudden Jackson Brown would be singing, but it'd be the second verse. Another 20 times through it, changing things around, working on it. So Glenn says he figured out that writing took a lot of elbow grease. It's kind of interesting. So anyway, in the meantime, a guy named Don Henley showed up from Texas. And you ever heard of Don Henley?
Nope.
Oh, well, you will. You've heard of the Eagles, right?
Yeah.
He's one of the head guys in the Eagles.
Oh.
We're just getting
I don't
the
know their
start.
names.
We're getting the start of this going here. We're going way early Eagles because I find it extremely interesting. It's how this, you kind of think, oh, maybe this was their first band, but now we've already talked like 5 bands that Glenn's been in. Maybe 6 if you count that one where he was going to go smoke pot and be with that one guy.
That one that never started.
Yeah. So anyway, at this time, Don Henley showed up from Texas. He started a little band called Shiloh. Now, he would play once in a while at the Troubadour, and there was a guy named Kenny Rogers. Have you ever heard of him?
Yes.
Anyway,
Oh,
Kenny
wait.
Rogers, he's a country singer. He's old now, but he was very...
Who's that guy in the sweater?
There's a lot of guys in sweaters.
No, that TV show?
Mr. Rogers.
Oh, not
Yeah,
him.
Not that guy.
Oh.
I think they're cousins.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're cousins.
Oh. Oops.
Kenny Rogers didn't live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
Is Kenny Rogers chicken? Is there that? Kenny Rogers roasters? Is that a thing?
I don't know. We'll have to check into that.
Look
Kenny
right now.
Rogers had many, many big hits. When you talk about country music, back then you had guys like Johnny Cash and Kenny Rogers that were big.
Johnny Cash.
Back when it was called country western, and it was much different than it is now, because actually country is at rock and roll. But back then there was country western, a separate thing from rock and roll.
And there is Kenny Rogers roasters.
After Kenny Rogers wasn't making hits anymore, he had a little chicken place. That's what I find so interesting about doing a show with such youngsters. We all learn stuff, right?
That's right.
Okay.
We all know different.
Have you ever heard of
we all
Linda
know
Ronstadt?
We're all
Okay. Anyway,
related.
there was a great woman singer back in that. A woman.
Yay!
Curb stomp. All right.
Women in the workplace.
And Linda Ronstadt was a very hot, I would say, country rock singer back at that time. He ran into her at the Troubadour, and they started singing, and he started playing in her band. And then he met Henley, and he says, "Hey, I know a gig. We can get $250 a week singing for this chick." And that's what they did. And it was awesome, but they had to tour. The whole thing was...
Wait, like each of them got $250?
Yeah, each.
Alright.
Big
Wow,
money.
that's
Big money. Yeah.
Lots of pot.
And so, yeah. And speaking of pot, Linda Ronstadt was a big partier. They said she could party him under the table. So they would party like crazy, work, which is, singing at concerts, and they would tour. And when they toured, they rode in a station wagon. You know what those are?
Yep.
I do.
And
Not
so
a
they
fan.
would get all their music, all their instruments, and the whole band, and they'd drive in a station wagon to each concert. That's what rock and roll was like back in the early
The
70s.
good old days.
Now it's all about them tour buses.
Yeah. So anyway, they learned a lot from her, and she had a manager named Boylan.
Boiling?
Oh,
Boiling
Like
hot?
boiling. Oh, I was gonna
Boiling.
say boiling water.
why can't I think of his first name? But I'm not going to remember.
Boylan is his first name.
Mr. Boylan. Okay, you can call
Whatever.
him Boylan, whatever.
Boylan?
Anyway,
Boylan.
he wanted to make a super group out of Linda and Glenn and Henley, but Glenn wanted his own band, and he went to
Oh,
Henley and he's
Glenn.
like, "Let's make our own band."
We don't need
and
no Boylan.
Henley's like, "Yeah, we don't need no super group.
Yeah.
Let's make our own band."
Men
And so-
only.
Yeah.
Sexist.
Yeah, they want. That's right. Anyway, Linda and Boylan, they were very supportive of these guys getting their own band because everybody was friends. They said, "Get Bernie Ledden to be in your band," and then they found Randy Meisner from a band called Poco, a band I can remember, and they made a band called the Eagles.
How did they decide on that name?
That I do not know, but I have a good story about their first album shoot involving an eagle.
Okay.
So, anyway, I'm going to get to that, but in chronological order. Anyway, so they got signed. They went to Aspen to write songs. Back in that time, in the early 70s, you know where Aspen is, the ski area.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, back then, it was like a Wild West town. And so they were there, they were writing songs, and they wrote Take It Easy. They wrote Witchy Woman. They wrote Peaceful Easy Feeling. They wrote Trying. All great songs. And they needed a producer, and they found a guy named Glenn Johns. This guy had produced for Led Zeppelin and The Who. And so they found him, and he's like, he listened to their music, and he's like, "Your music sucks. I don't want to be your producer."
Oh, big
he's like-
mistake, buddy.
He's like, "You guys are kind of rock sounding, and I'm sick of rock and roll because of The Who and Led Zeppelin. They burnt me out." And then he heard them sing a song called Seven Bridges. And that is one where there's no music in it, just them singing and harmonizing. And he was totally amazed, and he's like, "Maybe there's a chance you can be something." So he took him over to England, and they did this first album in 2 weeks. And that album's what put him on the charts. It has those hits I talked about, and they were amazing. So then they needed an album cover. And so they decided what we better do is stay at the bars until they close, take our peyote, take some whiskey and trail mix, and go to Joshua Tree. That's a famous place over near LA, up in the mountains. So they had a cameraman, a little like you, Ricky. And where they left after the bars closed, then they got to this Joshua Tree place, and they started hiking after they took their peyote. They got way up there and had a fire, and the sun was coming up. And then old Glenn decided he had to go pee. So he took off, and all of a sudden the band members said, "Hey, look up." And there was an eagle flying over his head, a giant one. And he was wasted. You know, I mean, peyote, that's like not LDS, LSD. Okay.
LS.
Anyway, so he looked up, and he could see what the eagle was thinking. And the eagle was looking down thinking, "Eagles? I don't think so." Okay.
That eagle was a snot.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a
He was.
snob.
But anyway, it was kind of an omen because then they became, you know, a really popular, great group. So I just think it's pretty cool that they got up there and that eagle flew over. They had a great album shoot. Then they went back and started touring and got real popular. And and that's when the tension began. The Eagles story is about all tension in the band.
Tension?
Yeah, tension.
Oh, no.
Glenn Fry wanted a rock and roll band. Bernie Ledden wanted a country band. Remember the
boy.
banjo?
Yeah,
There's
banjo
no place
boy.
for that in rock.
Get out, banjo
Right?
The
boy.
classic battle.
Anyway, so where was I? Anyway, they just started getting really great and really big, and then they decided we've got to have another album. But in the meantime, somebody gave them a book of American outlaws like Jesse James,
Billy
Butch
the Kid.
Cassidy, Billy the Kid, Doc Holliday, the Gunslinger.
Yeah.
And Glenn Fry he thought, this is really cool. We've got to do a concept album. And he's like, if we were born 100 years ago, we would have been gunslingers. So they did this album, which is just amazing because the music on it is all telling a story about gunslingers. And they went and recorded it over at England again. And they walked out of there thinking, we have got the best album, everything's great. And it bombed.
Oh,
And it didn't do good like their first album, which is really weird because it was a favorite of my girlfriends and I, who later became my wife. We'd listen to Desperado all the time. So many great songs, but it did have Tequila Sunrise on it, which helped them get bigger. And I got to tell you, there's this one set of tracks on there. It starts out with a song called Certain Kind of Fool, and then it has a little instrumental, kind of a Desperado instrumental, and then it has a song called Outlaw Man. And those three songs together, they have to be played together, are just fantastic. And even today, when I listen to that, when Outlaw Man starts, I get like a tingling in the back of my spine. That song is so good. And yet, like I say, it bombed. It was a real bummer for them. But they were still big, and they found out touring's a hard life. But most of the time, it was really a lot of fun. 90% of the time, they would ride in planes, smoke pot, drink. They developed a thing called the third encore. That's where you go, you have your concert, then you come out and do a couple of encores, and then you go have a giant party back in your motel room. Lots of pot, lots of booze, lots of women.
Of course.
And
Women? Kirby's
getting excited. And then and they would fill their tub with beer, and they would just like have these big
Sick.
parties.
Just take a
That's
bath
where I
of beer.
wanna
A
drink.
beer bath.
No, that's where I want to get
They
my
did.
beer from.
When I heard
Only
them,
if there's hot
I
wine in the
visualized
bathtub.
it the way you did, and then I started thinking, I'll bet there was ice in the tub, and they just had lots of beer bottles sitting. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah,
Because
yeah,
I
yeah.
visualized it, filled it
I'm
with
thinking
beer.
like keg put in there.
That's
pumped
what they
out.
needed. They needed
They should have
kegs.
done that, yeah.
These guys, what kind of manager did they really
Lightweights.
have? They needed kegs.
Pathetic.
But anyway, so then they were really getting big, but later Fry said of this, we made it and then it ate us. So people were treating him like superhumans by then, and he's like, hey, we're just normal people.
But that's like what got him interested in the first place.
He wanted to be a superhuman. He wanted the
Yeah.
women. But now that he is like super and people look at him like, wow, I can't believe you're just a person sitting there, They say dumb stuff like that. And he's like, I am just a person, But
I can't wait till
anyway,
that happens to me.
Yeah. Awesome.
that is. So anyway, they started having lots of disputes. They went to do their third album, which is On the Border, and they got to England, and they were really having disputes with, I didn't tell you about this Johns guy. He had a weird rule when they would do their recording. he wouldn't let them use drugs or alcohol while they were recording.
He wanted a pure sound.
Yeah, he did, and it kind of freaked him out, but they were doing good anyway that way. But like a little band that he had done, the Rolling Stones, they would like Keith Richards would go in the basement and get stoned and just hang out down there for a few hours while they're waiting to record. So it kind of burnt the guy out on rock and roll and drugs and all that. So he had that little rule. But they went over, they fought, they didn't get their third album done. They came back, hired another manager, because their old ones, like I said, Fry wanted a rock and roll band. The old one, their manager goes, "You guys are not a rock and roll band." And so they fired him, got a new guy. They fired that Leaden guy that was always saying we got to be country.
With his banjo.
Yeah.
Banjo boy.
The banjo sound left, and they found a remixing engineer that said, "Hey, I've been at a lot of recording studios doing remixing. I think I could produce as good as those producers." And they're like, "Whatever, man." So that's their new producer. His name's Bill Seismic. Then there was an album by Joe Walsh called "The Smoker You Drink, the Player You Get." Brian Henley said, "That's the kind of sound we want." And the guy's like, "Yeah, I was the mixer on that." So they hired him as producer. They wanted this sound of this Joe Walsh guy. You guys probably don't know who he is.
I've heard that name
He was
before.
super famous. He had a band called the James Gang that was awesome. Lots of big hits. Anyway, so they got the new producer. They went and did Eagles on the Border. It had singles like "Best of My Love," "Already Gone," and "James Dean." They hired a new guitar player to take over for that one guy. His name is Felder, and Don Felder. And he was quite a guitar player to get him a heavier, rockier sound. And Fry called this album a watershed album because it just happened. They'd like drink beer, smoke some pot, jam a while, and then drink some more beer, jam a lot, talk, and then all of a sudden these songs had come out. And then to me that's just amazing because of how famous these songs have been over time. Anyway, now they're touring big, they're going to other countries, and there was this one country they were going to and they all had drugs on them, and the customs agent said, "I want to search you." And they were like, "Oh no, we're toast."
Shoot.
Yeah.
Hate when that
And-
day comes.
Yeah. And so they were realizing they were going to go to jail, and then their new manager went over and whispered something in the ear of this customs agent, and then the customs agent's like, "Whatever, you guys can go in." Fry says, "That's when I figured out this guy's a great manager."
I
So
wonder what he said.
I don't know. That's the secret. Anyway, so then they recorded songs like "Take It to the Limit,"
I know that one.
"Lying Eyes," "After the Thrill Is Gone." And most of these songs Fry sang lead on. You know, these days when you hear about the Eagles, a lot of their songs have Henley singing lead. And he did sing lead back then. But it turns out some of the most popular ones at the time were Fry's songs. "Lying Eyes" was about women that would come meet them at concerts and hang out with them and do things.
Groupies.
Yes, and then go back to their husbands.
Ooh.
A lot of their
break.
songs were wrote, you know, with like experiences they were having. Anyway, so then they decided to get rid of Bernie Leaden. He was fighting with them, and they hired Joe Walsh to do more. And remember, he was the one they were like, "We want to sound like that album." All of a sudden, Joe Walsh is in their band. And I never could figure out how he ended up in their band because he was already a super group on his own. And so I found that to be amazing. And Glenn Fry said of Walsh, "This is an interesting adventure because Joe Walsh was an interesting bunch of guys." Walsh was like the king of room damage. Still is. He, one night, he did $28,000 of damage to just one room in one night with John Belushi. You know who James Belushi is? No. Ghostbusters?
Oh, yes.
Well, I think that might... John Belushi was the one in Ghostbusters, not James. James is the one that's still alive, his brother.
Oh.
John overdosed on drugs.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But anyway, he had come and was partying with Walsh, and they fried that room up. And Don Henley once said, "Usually this was kind of funny, as long as the TV that got dropped 14 stories landed in the pool and didn't hit anybody." At the same time, what I find interesting is Walsh was in awe of Fry and Henry. He says these guys could sing so good and they could write so good. And I find that really interesting because Walsh was a super accomplished writer and singer. And so that's where we're going to end the story this week, because the Eagles, being a supergroup, have a whole bunch more that happened. We're to 1975 now, and what we're going to talk about next week was, will they ever stop drugs? Can they do any better albums? Can they stay together with so many big egos as they have? And because there's 3 superstars already in the band and 2 almost superstars. And can they write any more popular songs? Like, maybe, do you think Hotel California?
Spoiler alert.
Oh,
Yeah.
boy.
So there's a lot to happen. The next week we'll have 40 years of the Eagles, all in probably a shorter time, maybe about the same amount of time as this. And a lot happened to those guys.
All right, till next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Curb Stomp has an important announcement to make.
Follow me on Instagram at CurbStomp2011. KIRBSTOMP 2011.
All right. That was a very important announcement. Oh, hey, everybody. Rick here. Just really quick before we end, I wanted to let you all know that we do have an email address where you can send us your thoughts, suggestions, questions, recommendations. We'd love to hear from you. So our email address is questions@CaptainKirkandRickRick.com. And Captain, it's not Captain, it's Captain. So it's questions@CapnKirkandRickRick.com.